Alexander Steele's world was perfectly calculated. Every hour, every deal, every decision fit into the rhythm of his meticulously crafted life. He wasn't just a man who built a company. He was the embodiment of control, the CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech empires in the country. His face had graced the cover of Fortune, his words were quoted in Harvard case studies, and his every move was tracked by business blogs and journalists who idolized him. But behind the sharp suits, the impenetrable boardroom confidence, and the empire worth billions was something much simpler and far more fragile. He was a father. Sophia, or Sophie as everyone called her, was his 8-year-old daughter. His late wife, Emily, had passed away when Sophie was just 3, leaving Alexander to juggle fatherhood with his empire. He had succeeded on paper. Sophie lived in a penthouse overlooking the city skyline, attended one of the most exclusive private schools, and had a small army of staff dedicated to ensuring she lacked nothing. But Alexander knew there was one thing his daughter still missed: a childhood that didn't feel like a business plan. Music was Sophie's latest fixation. She begged for piano lessons after a classmate dazzled the school talent show with Beethoven. Alexander, with his usual efficiency, told his assistant, "Find the most prestigious music teacher in the city, someone with credentials, reputation, results." He didn't care about anything else. Results were everything. So that Monday, when his assistant buzzed his office intercom to announce the teacher's arrival, Alexander glanced only briefly at his watch. He expected a gray-haired maestro with polished shoes, perhaps a professor who had once trained concert pianists. He rose, straightened his tie, and walked into the expansive living room where Sophie already sat excitedly by the grand piano. Instead of an imposing professor, a young woman stood nervously by the door. She had auburn hair pulled into a messy bun, a simple blouse, and a worn satchel slung over her shoulder. Her smile was polite but tentative, as though she didn't quite belong in a penthouse with glass walls and million-dollar art pieces. "Mr. Steele," she asked, her voice warm yet uncertain. "I'm Clara Hayes. I'm here for Sophie's lesson." Alexander paused. His sharp eyes swept over her from head to toe, instantly calculating. She didn't look like prestige. She didn't look like someone who charged $500 an hour to teach children of billionaires. She looked ordinary. Still, Sophie bounced off the couch and tugged Clara's hand with the ease of a child who didn't care about resumes. "Come on, Miss Clara. Show me how to play something." Within minutes, Clara was seated at the piano, her slender fingers brushing the ivory keys. The sound that filled the room was what Alexander had expected. It wasn't rigid, flawless technique. It was something softer, warmer. She played a simple tune, but her touch brought the keys alive, as if each note was a whispered story. Sophie leaned close, eyes wide with awe. Alexander stood in the corner, arms folded, trying to mask his surprise. He had anticipated scales, rigid discipline, maybe a lecture on posture. Instead, Clara laughed gently when Sophie pressed the wrong note and turned it into a game, weaving mistakes into a playful melody. His daughter's laughter filled the cavernous space, echoing against marble floors that usually knew only silence. For the first time in years, Alexander felt his home breathe. Clara wasn't what he ordered. She wasn't polished. She wasn't prestigious. But there was something in the way she guided Sophie's small hands across the keys, the patience in her voice, the encouragement in her smile. It was real. Over the next few weeks, the pattern repeated. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Clara arrived with her satchel and that same gentle smile. She never once seemed intimidated by Alexander's presence. If anything, she treated him like any other parent, reminding him to make sure Sophie practiced, or teasing lightly when he forgot to show up for the end of the lesson. And Sophie adored her. Lessons weren't lessons anymore. They were adventures. Clara brought sheet music tucked between storybooks, sometimes even homemade cookies shaped like musical notes. She transformed practice into laughter and the piano keys into magic. For Alexander, this was unsettling. He wasn't used to losing control of situations. Every person in his life, business partners, employees, even friends, fit neatly into a role. Clara didn't. She slipped past the walls he'd built, weaving herself into his daughter's heart and slowly into his own carefully guarded world. It all came to light one Friday afternoon. Sophie burst into his office, her curls bouncing as she tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy, Miss Clara says she can't stay long today because she has to pick up Ethan from school. Can Ethan come over next time? He's funny." Alexander frowned, caught off guard. "Ethan." Sophie grinned, "Her son." The words hit Alexander like a chord played in the wrong key. Son. Clara was a mother. His gaze flicked toward the living room where Clara stood packing her sheet music, cheeks flushed as though she'd been caught in a secret. Yes," she admitted softly, meeting his eyes. "I have a son, Ethan, he's 6. I wasn't sure if it was relevant." Relevant? That word spun in Alexander's mind long after she left that day. She was a single mom. He hadn't expected that. He had assumed she was some young teacher trying to build a career, not someone juggling lessons with raising a child. But then the puzzle pieces shifted into place. The worn satchel, the modest clothes, the exhaustion she sometimes tried to hide with a smile. Clara wasn't just teaching piano, she was surviving, providing, fighting for her child the way Alexander fought for Sophie. And something about that shook him more than any boardroom negotiation ever had. That evening, while Sophie hummed one of Clara's tunes before bed, Alexander stood by the window staring at the city skyline. He had built walls so high that no one could climb them, convincing himself that control meant safety, for him, for Sophie. But this woman, this accidental hire, had walked straight through the cracks without even trying. For the first time in years, Alexander wondered if fate had played a role. If, in trying to find the most prestigious teacher, he had stumbled into something his money could never buy: authenticity. And against every instinct screaming at him to stay detached, he realized he wanted to know more. About Clara, about Ethan, about the life she had fought so quietly to protect. Because maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the wrong teacher at all. Clara hadn't planned for her two worlds to collide so quickly. When Sophie spotted Ethan at the park one Saturday afternoon, darting around the jungle gym with his scruffy sneakers and gap-toothed grin, Clara's carefully maintained lines blurred. She had kept her son separate from her teaching job, worried that her personal life might jeopardize the opportunity. People like Alexander Steele, wealthy, powerful, untouchable, lived in a different universe from hers. And yet, here they were. Ethan and Sophie bonded instantly, as children often do. They were sprawled on the grass within minutes, laughing as they tried to invent a song using nothing but clapping and silly rhymes. Clara sat on a nearby bench, her heart tightening with both pride and apprehension. When she looked up, Alexander was there, his tall figure unmistakable even among the Saturday crowd. He stood watching the children, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Clara braced herself. She expected judgment, maybe irritation that his daughter was playing with a boy who didn't attend an elite academy, who wore hand-me-down clothes, whose mother scraped together extra money by teaching piano lessons in high-rise apartments. But Alexander surprised her. He walked over, silent for a moment, then lowered himself onto the bench beside her. His suit jacket looked out of place in the park, but he didn't seem to care. His gaze remained fixed on the children. "That's your son?" he asked at last. "Yes," Clara replied cautiously. "Ethan, he's 6. Alexander gave a small nod, his jaw tightening slightly as though weighing the revelation. "Sophie hasn't stopped talking about him since yesterday." Clara blinked. She hadn't realized Sophie had mentioned Ethan at home too. The thought made her cheeks warm. "They get along," she said softly. "They do," Alexander admitted, his voice lower this time. And for the first time, Clara caught something in his tone, something that wasn't the commanding CEO or the distant father. something almost human. The weeks that followed only deepened the connection. What started as occasional playdates turned into regular gatherings. Sometimes Clara would bring Ethan to the penthouse after lessons, where the children would stage impromptu concerts in the living room. Other times, Alexander would join them at the park, surprising Clara by leaving his phone in his pocket instead of glued to his hand. Clara saw subtle changes in him. He asked Sophie about her practice without being prompted. He even attempted to sit at the piano himself one evening, awkwardly plunking out a clumsy rendition of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, while both children collapsed in laughter. Clara laughed too, genuine, unguarded laughter she hadn't felt in years. Still, the differences between their worlds loomed like skyscrapers. Clara couldn't ignore them. She was a single mom juggling 3 jobs, stretching every dollar to cover rent, bills, and school supplies. Alexander, by contrast, signed contracts that moved millions with a flick of his pen. He lived in a penthouse where chandeliers hung like stars, while she lived in a 2-bedroom apartment where the walls carried every neighbor's voice. And yet, despite the imbalance, he kept showing up. One Thursday evening, Clara lingered after Ethan had been picked up by a neighbor. Sophie had fallen asleep on the couch mid-practice, her small fingers curled around sheet music. The room was quiet, city lights glittering beyond the glass walls. Clara turned to leave, but Alexander's voice stopped her. "You don't always have to hide it," he said suddenly. She frowned. "Hide what?" "That you're doing this alone." His eyes, usually so guarded, softened as they met hers. "I know what it's like." Clara's chest tightened. She wanted to tell him he couldn't possibly understand, that being a single mother was different, harder, lonelier. But then she saw it in his expression, the same tiredness she carried, the same grief, the same weight of being both protector and provider. He did understand, just in a different way. From then on, something unspoken bound them. They didn't call it friendship or romance or anything at all. But their evenings began to carry a rhythm, like music building to something inevitable. Still, love, especially unexpected love, wasn't simple. Clara worried constantly. What if people thought she was using him? What if his world swallowed hers whole, leaving Ethan and her adrift? She didn't want charity. She didn't want pity. She wanted respect. And Alexander had his own fears. His late wife's absence still haunted him. He had built walls to keep that pain locked away, walls so strong that even his closest business partners never saw the cracks. To care for Clara and Ethan meant opening those walls again. It meant risking heartbreak. The breaking point came one stormy night. Ethan had developed a sudden fever, burning hot and frighteningly fast. Clara panicked. She rushed him to the hospital in the pouring rain, her hands shaking as she filled out forms, whispering reassurances to her delirious son. She didn't call anyone. She never called anyone. She was used to doing things alone. But Alexander showed up anyway. He arrived at the hospital in the middle of the night, his tailored suit soaked through, his phone forgotten. Clara stared at him in shock as he strode across the sterile corridor, straight to her side. "How did you?" "Sophie told me," he interrupted, his voice tight. "She heard you on the phone before the lesson ended." Clara blinked, realizing Sophie must have overheard her hurried call to the hospital. But before she could reply, Alexander reached for her trembling hands, wrapping them in his. "You're not alone," he said firmly, "not anymore." Something inside Clara broke at those words. The dam she'd built to contain her fear, her loneliness, her exhaustion. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she leaned into him, letting herself believe, just for a moment, that she didn't have to carry everything by herself. Hours later, when Ethan's fever finally broke and the doctor reassured her that he'd be fine, Clara returned to the waiting area. Alexander was still there, unshaven, exhausted, but refusing to leave. "You didn't have to stay," she whispered. "Yes," he said quietly, meeting her eyes with a steadiness that stole her breath. "I did." It was then, in that sterile hospital corridor with thunder still rumbling outside, that Alexander finally spoke the words he had buried for weeks. "Clara, you weren't the wrong teacher. You were exactly the one we needed. Sophie, Ethan, me." Her tears turned into a smile then, shaky but radiant. And when she squeezed his hand, it wasn't just gratitude, it was trust. The days that followed weren't perfect. They faced questions from Sophie's teachers, whispers from Alexander's colleagues, doubts from Clara's own heart. But through it all, one truth remained unshakable. They were stronger together. Sophie and Ethan became inseparable, their laughter weaving a bond like siblings. And Alexander, once the man who measured life in balance sheets and stock prices, found himself learning to measure it in bedtime stories, pancake breakfasts, and stolen glances across a piano bench. He was still the CEO, still the man fortune adored, but with Clara he became something else, something rarer, a man who could love again. And Clara, who had walked into his penthouse that first day with nothing but a worn satchel and quiet determination, realized she had found more than just a job. She had found a partner, a father figure for her son, a safe place for her heart. Sometimes life doesn't give us what we order. Sometimes it gives us what we need. For Alexander and Clara, the wrong hire was the beginning of everything.